Hey guys, I'm just going to start by showing you the trailer.
When I was young, Breadwinner, I knew what peace felt like. Stories remain in our hearts even when all else is gone.
My family is in a desperate situation.
Girl, stop when I tell you!
I'm going to find Boba.
No, you're not.
I'm going! There's nothing you can do to stop me.
Maybe if we think of it like a story, huh?
Is it a happy story or a sad story?
Just wait and see.
So thank you so much for coming along today. Thanks so much to the View Conference for inviting me here. It's my first time here, and Turin is such a beautiful place to hold a meetup like this. My name is Mark Mullery, and I'm the technical director for a studio in Kilkenny in Ireland. That studio is called Cartoon Saloon, and I'm here to talk to you about our most recently completed film, The Breadwinner. The Breadwinner is a 2D animated independent feature produced across 3 countries, Ireland, Canada, and Luxembourg. It's the story of a young Afghan girl, Parwana, who must cut her hair to pass as a boy in order to feed her family after her father's wrongful arrest by the Taliban. Like all of Cartoon Saloon's features, The Breadwinner is primarily a work of classical hand-drawn animation, albeit in its modern computerized form. Though its multi-tiered narrative allows for an expansion of styles and techniques that I hope to share with you today. So The Breadwinner is based on the book of the same name, written for young adults by the Canadian author and humanitarian Deborah Ellis. Deborah wrote the book after conducting extensive interviews with Afghan refugees in camps in Pakistan. Sure. The screenplay was adapted from this work by the screenwriter and filmmaker Anita Doron, best known for her film The Lesser Blessed, which is about First Nation teenagers. Finally, and crucially, The Breadwinner was directed by Cartoon Saloon co-founder Nora Twomey. Nora is best known for co-directing the Oscar-nominated Secret of Kells, along with another founding member of Cartoon Saloon, Tom Moore. The book was optioned by Aircraft Pictures in Canada. The key people there are Anthony Leo and Andrew Rosen, both producers of The Breadwinner. Aircraft's best known for North American live-action television, such as Todd and The Book of Pure Evil. But using live action to faithfully recreate the environment and conditions of Taliban-ruled Afghanistan would be prohibitively expensive for an independent production. So Aircraft began to explore the medium of animation as a possible vehicle to get this important story onto the big screen. But of course, Aircraft didn't have any experience in this medium and needed to find partners who had. Thankfully for us, Cartoon Saloon was on the top of their list of potential collaborators. So Cartoon Saloon is a relatively small animation studio in a very small town called Kilkenny in Ireland. Cartoon Saloon's a creator-driven studio and over the years has produced 2 TV series, Skunk Fu and Puff and Rock. We've also produced 3 independent features, the Oscar-nominated The Secret of Kells, the also Oscar-nominated Song of the Sea, and now this one. We've produced several shorts and have many years of service work under our belts too. Finally, we're already in the process of storyboarding our next feature, which is called Wolfwalkers. I don't have anything to say about that here unless anybody cares to ask me afterwards. Melusine Productions in Luxembourg and their Studio 352 came on board as co-producers, took a sizable portion of the key animation, cleanup animation, and backgrounds on the film. And finally, Guru Studio in Canada took on the immense task of compositing The Breadwinner's 2 distinct artistic styles. And we had a lot of advisors on this film, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our executive producer, Angelina Jolie, whose work with girls' schools in Afghanistan proved to be an invaluable source for us. So how to talk about Afghanistan? This is a bit of a diversion, but I don't know if any of you are familiar with the podcast Hardcore History, but if you've never listened to it, I highly recommend it. The presenter, Dan Carlin, he always tries to explain just one event, such as the Battle of Thermopylae, but in order to give it context, he ends up backtracking 100 or 200 or sometimes 1,000 years, and often the podcast is over 4 hours long, and only the last hour is about the event he actually intended to discuss. So why am I telling you this? Well, in 2015, I was finishing up on 2 years working on a TV series, and I really didn't want to take on another major project. But when I was offered this feature, one of the things that gave me pause and made me consider taking it on was that years earlier I'd read a history of the Taliban in a book simply named Taliban by the Pakistani journalist Ahmed Rashid. I'd been engrossed in that book for a couple of months, and I really had Afghanistan on the brain for years after, so I felt I really had to say yes to this project. And one thing I noted was that, like in Dan Carlin's podcasts, Rashid spent almost a third of the book discussing Afghanistan's ancient history, as explaining a relatively recent phenomenon such as Taliban rule was impossible without lengthy historical context. Now, our film's not strictly about the Taliban, but indeed we found that in making this film we needed to take a few minutes at least to tell the story of Afghanistan too. We didn't have 3 spare hours. Now, once again, I feel like I can't even make this presentation to you without giving a few minutes to the subject. So Afghanistan is, by cliche, known as the graveyard of empires. This is because many great entities successfully invaded it, but never managed to hold control for long. So these include the Persians, Greeks, Mongols, Sikhs, the British, and the USSR. And it's this last invasion I mentioned, the USSR, and the subsequent civil war that left Afghanistan in the form that we find it in our film. Similarly, it's worth discussing Afghanistan's demographic makeup. It has 4 major ethnic groups: the Pashtuns, the Tajiks, the Hazara, and the Uzbeks. And there are many smaller groups too. The Taliban are, generally speaking, a Pashtun phenomenon, but not exclusively. And certainly the majority of Pashtuns didn't subscribe to Taliban ideology. And there are 2 major languages, Dari and Pashto, which the majority of the country understand, but there are other languages too. And it's because of this complexity, as well as for other reasons, that we had to rely on many, many Afghan experts, including Afghan women's groups, because we really wanted to get the details right. So one of those details was the voices, so I'd just like to show you a little feature that we have on that.
Nora Twomey, and I'm the director of the Breadwinner. So I suppose one of the major concerns was the cast. It's such a huge part of the film, and again, if you're looking for animators to animate something like 4 seconds a week, you want to bring home something to them that they're going to believe in. So you have to make the actors believe in it and make sure that they do. And I suppose going into a dark booth where you have to use your imagination in terms of imagining where the character was, who they were interacting with, because we recorded them one at a time. It's a big job, I suppose. But we had a casting director called Merlan Ridley who put posters up around Afghan markets around Toronto, and we got a great response from a lot of Afghan actors, and we cast Afghan actors wherever we could. So Kawa Ada, who plays the part of Razak and is also a dialogue coach, helped the actors as much as he could to get everybody's accent into the same sphere in terms of their pronunciations, and to make sure that everybody hit the same level, I suppose, and made sure that everybody belonged to the same film, belonged to the same family. So we recorded the cast over 5 days, and it was a huge job, but again, I suppose the cast themselves brought so much to each particular part that it really helped the animators and energized every department that came after them and became a massive part of the film.
Well, first of all, it was such a tremendous opportunity for me because I've never really worked behind the scenes on a feature. And to be there through rehearsals and to be there while the records were happening, I learned a tremendous amount. But also, I was able to see these incredible actors come in, some who'd never done it before, and then some really young, seasoned professionals, and to see how our director, Nora, was able to bring these performances out of these actors in such a real and heartfelt manner, and everything is about the truth and finding the truth. And as the dialect coach, that's vital for me. because I want to make sure that the dialect is truthful without getting in the way of the performance.
I played Pervana. In the beginning of the story, she's scared. She's a girl in Afghanistan, and she knows that she's not to really show her emotion or show herself, except when she's at home. And then her father gets taken away, and then she becomes a boy. And when she's a boy, she feels a lot stronger and that she has more power. And then she tells her stories, and they come to life.
I was born in Afghanistan. There's a small area called Mullery. It's very small, and my cousins, my family, that's where they grew up. And sort of during the invasion of the Taliban, we sort of moved on to different places like Iran, Tajikistan, and then we finally went to Russia, Moscow. And from then we came to Canada. Hopefully one day I might go and visit if it's, there's no war happening.
Razak is part of the Taliban regime. He's so torn, I think, between the world that he's grown up in and love and what's the right thing to do. I certainly know, having been born in Afghanistan, fleeing the war, that when I was a child, my mother really getting her kids to live in an imaginary world helped us move through war and move through displacement. And finally, when we came to Canada, I think we kept that strength of imagination alive.
You and I are going to find Boba. The boy said he was being taken to Pulechaki prison, so that's where we are going. Suroyo is writing a letter for the prison governor to protest Nurul's arrest and ask for his release. At least I can give them that.
If I'm not back before the sun has gone down, you run. Run as far away as you can from here, and you keep on running. You can't stay here after sunset, you understand?
We are leaving Kabul tomorrow. It's been arranged. There's nothing I can do. My sister is getting married in Mazar-e-Sharif. Tomorrow I'm going back to the prison. I found someone who can help me, and I need to get more money to bribe the guard. I need it today.
What do you want me to do? Magic some money into your hand like in your kids' stories? It doesn't work like that, Parwana. I can't help you. Now run away to Mazar-e-Sharif and have a nice wedding party. Maybe they'll find a husband for you too, and your troubles will be over. Until after the wedding, at least. You fool.
Okay, so let's talk about the visual development for a few minutes. On The Breadwinner, we actually had 2 art directors, which is rarely advisable. Iranian-born Reza Riyahi's stark and idiosyncratic style was the jumping-off point for both our characters and their environment. But the film's broad vistas and intimate interiors were developed with the help of Kieran Duffy, an Irish artist who's worked with us in Cartoon Saloon for years. So we'll come back to Kieran's work shortly, but let's start with Reza. So Reza's concepts are a primordial iteration of the world we eventually built together. I suppose they can be read many ways, but I see these as strangely harsh. You can see a world in which person and space are one and the same, a motif we kept throughout to the final look of the film. In the final look on screen, men and boys disappear into their surroundings and can go about their business unnoticed. But girls in colourful dress and women in bright blue burqas are conspicuous even when they seem otherwise hidden. So Reza continued to develop our character designs through all phases of production, but at a certain point you can begin to see Kieran Duffy's world building start to come through. So shape and form begins to take hold in these still early concepts from Kieran, relying on Cartoon Saloon's signature watercolor aesthetic and complete disregard for regular perspective, which can be seen in The Secret of Kel, Song of the Sea, and actually in our TV series Puff and Rock as well. The thing is, with the exception of the energy imbued by some burned-in bright lights, for me, these images remain just that, just images, like beautiful images, I hope, but not yet a real world, not a world in which millions of people live. At a certain point during pre-production, we had an epiphany that, as with all epiphanies, is obvious once it's come to you. We moved away from watercolors and towards dry brush, because Ireland is wet and Afghanistan is dry. Who knew? Even with this approach, a degree of wonky sort of abstraction remains. Objects sitting on shelves are still mere geometry, not tactile things. Sometimes they're nothing but sharp glass lines, no form at all to them. Representations of objects, figures, environments, light and space hold their own internal logic, like a painting by De Chirico. And at some point, the monochromatic primaries of the intense, almost sort of cubist architecture of the artist's imagination needed to give way to the dusty realities of Kabul. One of our Afghan advisors stressed to us that Kabul really is a very dusty place, especially when the wind picks up. Still, we learned that we weren't confined to just shades of grey, dust, chalk, and intense white lights. There's always room for warmth. But eventually, even our newfound dry brushstrokes became something that Kieran described as keeping the audience at arm's length. And put another way, this is not a world, it's merely a painting of one. But life under the Taliban was harsh, and just because they banned photography of any kind doesn't mean we as filmmakers can hide away from the realities of those years in Afghanistan. Eventually, light and form become the basis of our world. Even though there are no figures present, for me, this is the first concept image that I felt I could really step into. This is painted by an Iraqi artist, Zainab Fadi. She worked with us in Kilkenny for about a year. So at last, in images like this, we have a palette, a world, a set of rules. It took some time, but at last we have a real world for our characters to inhabit. Now, as I said, actual contemporaneous reference was essentially impossible to come by. The Taliban banned photography and filming of any kind. It apparently became a regular sight to see television sets and VHS cassettes hanging from electricity poles and ribbons of magnetic tape flickering in the breeze. And what little reference of Kabul we did have showed a husk of a city bombed to within an inch of its life. Apocryphal or not, the figure of 80% of the city being in a state of ruin kept coming up in our research. Still, showing our pre-production work to Afghans who had lived there during the 90s, they all responded the same way. We need to show more damage, more decay, more cracks, more bullet holes, more rubble. So here you can see an internal document urging our artists to dismantle more and more of our character's environment. And here you can see how in some of our preliminary master layouts, we tried to make many of the buildings to be husks of whatever they once were. And ultimately, though we did have many desaturated greys, browns, and chalks, and deep shadows in some of the interiors, we also had many bursts of color, especially when there's food or produce of any kind. And here we have an interior establishing shot of a candy factory in Kabul, which really does exist. And you can see some further bursts of light and color, not just through the hole in the ceiling, but in the colored candy in the bottom third as well. So we're still left with a question, though. How do we represent the inner lives of our characters? How do we describe the way that they talk to each other, the way they describe themselves and each other? A major part of our film is about the tradition of storytelling in Afghanistan, and we wanted to visualize this. So Reza, who, as I said, is Iranian, introduced us to the tradition of Persian miniatures, and this seemed like the direction for us to take. Persia was one of the aforementioned empires who once ruled the land now known as Afghanistan. So pretty much immediately we began exploring paper cutout techniques as a means to animate images such as these. And we researched extensively how paper cutout behaves, how it looks, how light bounces off it, how reflective surfaces burn into the camera and tiny drop shadows appear beneath each piece of paper, how raised portions react to directional lights, and how scissor-cut sharp edges leave rings of light around colored shapes. Eventually, these scenes allowed us to inject moments of intense color into the early sequences of the film. And what begins as a necessary contrast to the desaturated real-world sections slowly seeps into that real world. And ultimately, we end up, once again, with some fairly intense primary colors as the film reaches its tense crescendo. Okay, so that's the look of the film, but let's try to get a bit more into the weeds as we leave visual development and enter the production phase. I'm going to talk through as many stages of production as I can, from layout and scene prep, through posing, animation, ink and paint, background, and comp. I'm going to try cover as much as I can. Okay, so first, layout. Now, layout's a fairly confused term now with the advent of CG, but we just mean the black and white drawing that represents the stage for the characters to act on. You really, really need to get this stage right, no matter how long it takes. So we take a telescopic approach to this stuff. That means that relatively few people make up the groundwork of the film, and that lets us keep a consistency through later departments. We started on layouts around September 2015, and for me, that's when production began in earnest on The Breadwinner. So with layouts, we started as we meant to go on. We trashed early by having an in-depth layout kick-off meeting for each sequence, and in general, we had a few of those every week until we made our way through the whole film. In Cartoon Saloon, a layout kick-off meeting is where the directing team hash out the entire sequence and get all our arguments out of the way before building a list of layouts, briefing the layout artists, and so on. See, on an independent feature, if you're still arguing about fundamental questions after the layout stage, you're in big trouble. But as a result of this discipline, we more or less never returned to a sequence to rethink it after the layout stage because we put the effort in up front. And I want to stress that we can't afford to restart production halfway through, so we have to have every conceivable argument in advance. So our layouts are never approved rough, never sent to the animators rough. Now, they didn't necessarily, I mean, as you can see in some of these, they didn't necessarily have the final line or whatever, but in terms of space, in terms of layers, they're an unchanging stage on which the action takes place. We had a dedicated checker with a professional background in compositing to check each of these before they proceeded to animation and background and so on. The thing is, we were striving for something very real in this film, and unusually for a film like this, the artists didn't just receive a briefing from their animation director, they actually had a package of materials which included footage of the voice actors like you would have seen there, so that their expressions could be read and invoked, which in itself isn't so unusual, but they also had some live action reference that Nora, our director, made for the entire film. So I'm going to show you some of that now, and it doubles as a progression from voice and storyboard all the way up to comp, so hopefully you'll see what I mean.
Again, as a matter of fact, as we can make all of this one movement. I'm flipping through the book to try and find something to read. So this one here is just to see Parwana coming in, see the difference between herself and Soraya in the blue here. And watch the difference in their posture when they sit down.
Well, what about a little story before dinner, and we'll forget all about dresses for a while.
Maybe Parwana would like to read something for us.
Not right now, Mama John. I'm tired.
She's not a child anymore, she tells me. So she doesn't like stories.
Don't be in such a hurry to grow up, my sweet girl. It might not be all that you expect.
Well, what about a little story before dinner, and we'll forget all about dresses for a while.
Maybe Parwana would like to read something for us.
Not right now, Mama John. I'm tired.
She's not a child anymore, she tells me. So she doesn't like stories.
Don't be in such a hurry to grow up, my sweet girl. It might not be all that you expect.
Well, what about a little story before dinner, and we'll forget all about dresses for a while.
Maybe Parwana would like to read something for us.
Not right now, Mama John. I'm tired.
She's not a child anymore, she tells me. So she doesn't like stories.
Don't be in such a hurry to grow up, my sweet girl. It might not be all that you expect.
Okay, so for our main animation, we relied on a piece of software from France called TV Paint. It's actually pretty idiosyncratic, but our artists really love it because it's a drawing tool. And I really want to stress that. It's for drawing and it's for painting. It has no 3D functionality. As such, it has no rigging capability. It's not even vector-based. It's entirely raster-based, so it's more like Photoshop. It allows our artists to draw when they want to draw, but it takes some of the sting out of filling, slicing, stamping images, repeating images. Its advantages over paper, of course, would include its functionally infinite number of layers. It allows you to flip between specified drawings. It lets you take drawings off the pegs temporarily as you flip, which helps you maintain volumes even when your character's making very, very broad movements. This is something that's probably forgotten about now in CGI animation, but actually maintaining characters' sizes and volumes is still one of the big challenges for a hand-drawn feature. Okay, so let's talk about scene prep and posing. So one thing we've borrowed from a modern live action and CGI is a form of previs that we call scene prep. Scene prep is just where we pull the layouts that I showed you a few minutes ago into TV Paint. They would have been made in Photoshop. So they get pulled into TV Paint to become the unchanging stage for all subsequent departments. So scene prep is about the character's environment. Posing, on the other hand, which you're going to see as well, is where we work out the character's broadest movements through the film. So hopefully the distinction will be a little bit clearer in these videos. As you can see, the prep has very rough character drawings, not on model, and only really as a size reference and to aid framing. In some cases, the character's model sheet is placed in there multiple times, and again, that's purely for size and positioning. Scene prep is the final stage of layout, which, as I said, is the character's stage or environment. So it's where we make sure that everything that looked good in Photoshop actually works in the scene context. So posing, on the other hand, is where the characters are actually on model, and a lot of the broader acting decisions and continuity are nailed down. So in a 2D feature like this, scene planning pass is absolutely essential to approving layouts and continuing on with backgrounds and animation. Posing, though, that's actually the first stage of animation, and in many ways this was a less intensive pass, actually, than Cartoon Saloon would have done on previous films, especially on Secret of Kells. Especially on Song of the Sea, which is to say there were fewer poses, but we did what we could to hit every relevant mark, characters entering and leaving buildings and so on. It also meant that we could plot out the action of the whole film with just 6 experienced animators who managed to keep a consistency of drawing and of character too across the whole film. But it also helped us keep an understated and delicate feeling to the performances. And again, this is telescopic because where we had 6 pose artists, each of whom were personally responsible for several entire sequences, we had 60 animators who could work on scenes scattered, throughout the whole film. Because of the groundwork laid down by these 6 pose artists, it was possible for us to hire animators of various skill levels and even to give trainees a chance. So now, okay, let's talk about rough and clean animation. So our experienced animators tend to work as key animators and can work relatively rough if they want. The assistants will do the in-betweening as well as the cleaning up the line work. Now, so as you can see, it actually gets a bit rougher from the posing, but it's still very much on model, and they often provide timing charts for the assistant animators, which you can see flickering on and off. Does everyone remember timing charts? They're still a thing. Then you see some of the cleanup there. In the end, we actually have some very clean work, and as you can see from the shot where the 2 characters crawl into the cave, we made sure that animators were respecting the layouts and the overlays as well as they could. One of the advantages of working in the 21st century, even though this is hand-drawn, is that the characters can be filled with white to distinguish them from the layouts, and the scene files can contain overlays and underlays so that there's no ambiguity about where things are, and that was far harder to do on paper. Okay, so I'm very proud of some of the animation we have here, and rather than try and blow you away with something bombastic, I have my favorite scene to show you, and it's really just a nice piece of acting. I was doing a little animation workshop for 15 to 21-year-olds a few weeks ago, and I showed them this scene 7 or 8 times. Each time I asked them to focus on a different part of the right-hand character's face to watch how her pupils sort of dart around the other character's face trying to read her expression. Her mouth curls up in skepticism. She darts a glance back at her friend before reaching into her pocket, darts her eyes down to the photograph in her hand to gain her friend's attention. So I won't put you through that today. I'm not going to show it to you 7 or 8 times. I'm just going to show it to you once. But what I'd like you to do, if you can, is to just focus on the right-hand character. She's the one doing most of the talking, but I just really like some of the very subtle animation that happens here.
I heard brick making pays well, but it's hard work.
I wish I was stronger.
But you have an older brother, don't you? He used to bring you to school on his shoulders. What's his name?
Suleiman. He died.
How? Was it a sickness?
I don't know.
But your mother must have told you.
She doesn't speak of it, all right?
All right. Hey, look what I've got.
So I like that. It's just a nice little delicate piece. Now, before I move on to digital ink and paint and comp, I just want to talk about backgrounds for a couple of minutes. As you saw earlier, our background paintings spatially match our layouts perfectly. The only thing is that a single layout may serve multiple detail paintings of backgrounds, may serve multiple backgrounds whose only real difference is lighting or time of day. So a single black and white image, a layout, might be painted many different sizes, many different ways, each of which we would call a background. So again, this is the telescopic principle. So let's, how's that looking? You can barely see it, but okay. We're going to watch a background painting build up. So that's quite abstract right now. That's just the sky. But here we have the furthest layers of hills and hillside houses, which are painted very abstractly. And there are exceptions to this, but in general, we didn't really use any optical blurs in the compositing stage. So whenever something like these houses in the distance will be out of focus to any extent, we tended to just paint them that way, or rather than wait for a comp to do it with more sort of computerized blurs. So now we've got some mid-ground buildings painted with a bit more clarity, but actually this is really still just backdrop imagery. And this is our real midground. Now, as you can see, there's some more bleed as you get closer to the foreground. Again, this is just to help the compositors multiplane the image if that's called for. Now, there's really actually quite a lot of clarity in the foreground layers now. And one can discern more specific details, or electricity poles and wires, planks on the wooden doors. There are even some blankets there on the right hanging up. Now, I'm not sure how this is going to read on the projector, but if you take a look at the mosque in the middle left, there's a haze and color correct layer bundled with the most upper foreground layer, which is coming next. That should visibly change the colors a little bit. So it should look a little bit warmer. I'm not sure how well that read. And just note that we wouldn't actually bundle them together. They would be separate for the compositor. It's really just for this demo. So if you have a look now, hopefully you can't see any of the seams. In the end, it should look like one contiguous environment, possibly even look like a single painting rather than an obvious composite. This is all in Photoshop, of course, but many elements are physically painted and scanned depending on how the individual artist likes to work. So I'll show you another one. This is a very abstract background painting, which won't make too much sense until we see the next layer. And that's a bit clearer, I hope. The shot should make more sense, though you'll see there are some unpainted sections at the bottom and sides. That's because we are actually looking through a window in this shot. I really love this one, because not only does the window tint the colors of the BG outside, of the background outside, but it also has little sort of smudges in the center pane. As I said, we wanted to paint these things rather than to just use Gaussian blurs or whatever. So I'm just going to show that to you again. Maybe you can see the difference. If you focus on the center pane, a little bit more smudging happening there. Okay, so let's talk about the ink and paint and composite. So I'll play some of those same scenes from earlier, and you'll see some digital ink and paint on the characters, plus the basic color background. Then when the screen wipes, you'll see everything that's been re-added or purpose-built in comp, and that's the final image that's in the cinema. Okay, so the animation's first colored, textured, registered to the BG, after which all the various haze layers, effects layers, color correct layers are brought in. You can also see there's some filtering happening around the edges. It doesn't exactly make a vignette, but it adds a certain sense of depth that's working subconsciously, hopefully. Digital ink and paint happened in Canada along with comp, and this is where kind of the real visual depth starts to appear on screen for me. So my professional background is actually in final picture, and I've never worked on a production where the comp briefs were as detailed as those that Nora did up. Nora was basically asking for a Dutch masterpiece in every interior shot, and astonishingly to me, Guru in Canada, our compositors, they really rose to meet that challenge, and they were genuinely happy to receive such detailed direction. They work in Nuke, which is more traditionally associated with 3D animation and live action. For an independent 2D hand-drawn filter, it's kind of felt like using a sledgehammer to push a thumbtack. But as I said, we were incredibly impressed with the quality and with the range of color they had over light, or range of control, excuse me, that they had over light and color. Now you might notice that as well as color correction, particles, etc., there are actually extra characters appearing in the background of certain shots. So we actually had this tiny little department, just 2 animators and me supervising directly, who populated Kabul with crowds of people. So these characters are vector characters. So the actual job itself wasn't too difficult. As an animator, they could draw, build, rig, animate, color a character in half a day. And each of them were semi or often fully reusable. Because we could switch out their colors, switch out their heads, take off their glasses, shave their beards, things like that. The thing that was actually a very difficult brief, though, to fulfill, because they needed to appear as developed and on style as the foreground main characters, but they couldn't be distracting or eye-catching, especially when we want to focus on an intimate conversation in the foreground. So yeah, these are all vector-based, built and rigged in a program called Moho, which I'll talk about shortly. The second huge challenge we went through here was that as Guru were working on the ink and paint for our main character animation, including the addition of textured, sketchy outline, we had to race to match that appearance as their dailies were coming through. The sketchy outer line was actually the hardest thing to get right because in the end it's only really visible on a vector character that walks in the foreground. The boiling effects on the lines of the background characters was just too noisy and too distracting because we're not even supposed to be looking at these characters anyway. Other than that, we needed to manage them by eye on a scene-by-scene basis, but other than that, it wasn't too much of a challenge. But for the story world sections, the paper cutout sections of the film, we didn't actually use paper cutout. We don't even have a darkroom in Cartoon Saloon to shoot it, let alone one that could handle multiple desks and animators. It's not scalable for us at all. We didn't have anyone on staff experienced in this, and even if we did, we couldn't iterate our shots. It's a completely destructive process. What we did have was a lot of expertise and infrastructure with the aforementioned software Moho. At the time, that was actually known as Anime Studio Pro. So here's Jeremy Purcell, one of our directors in Cartoon Saloon and sequence director for the cutout sequences. He's showing us the Moho interface with a character rig from Puff and Rock, and I'm going to show you some footage from Puff and Rock in a moment. Moho is very much a 2D software as well, but unlike TV Paint, it is vector-based. It has a bone rig interface that'll be familiar to anybody who's worked with Maya, 3D Max, or Blender. It has auto in-betweening, obviously, as one would expect. It's undeniably our twin workhouse software along with TV Paint. So I'm showing you some work from that show, Puff and Rock, a series we did a couple of years ago. This was produced with Moho and just composited in After Effects. The rigs from Puff and Rock were, at the time, the most elaborate rigs that had been built in Moho. But the team absolutely blew through that with the character rigs for Breadwinner. So the process that was developed by Jeremy together with Guru Studio was to build vector characters with painted textures that followed the rules of cutout animation. No squash and stretch, no changes in scale, use of substitution or replacement for turnarounds and for mouth shapes. And then from Moho, various renders were sent out to Nuke. Every single individual piece of paper is sent to the compositing department as a separate layer, and each of those is actually made of several other renders, each of which makes the image slightly less perfect. This is because vectors tend to look too perfect and not quite believable. Okay, so I'm going to try and go into some detail with that. So we're going to look at some final shots. I'll try to show you where each of these is taking effect. So the main render, this is just a totally normal shot we would have. The main render is just the paper texture that you can see on the character. Then there's what's called a bump layer that allows light to bounce differently off the surface of the paper. This is just a very, very subtle effect, generally speaking. Of course, there's a drop shadow that appears underneath each piece of paper. This is an exaggerated shot, I think, that should highlight it. there's what's called an edge layer. That makes it appear as though there are scissor-cut edges that are catching the light. It's especially visible on the plants there along their edge, but it actually should be visible everywhere, really. Then there's a transparency render that allows subtle bits of light to pass through like grease paper. So this shot is implied to be backlit. So it looks like there's light coming from behind the paper, and in the magnified section there on the left, you can see the character's little stick leg is visible through the trouser. And then there's what's called a speck layer, which allows certain elements to catch light, like the gold leaf detailing in the crown there. Lastly, there's a height layer, which implies that some layers are marginally closer to the camera than others. Remember, this isn't a 3D shot at all. It's just implied to be. So it's not by much, but it's just enough to imply that, say, one piece of paper is glued on top of another, which would leave you with a little bit of a gap. So this is the crown shot again, and actually the depth is quite exaggerated in the crown there. Okay, so to go into a little bit more detail, and then we're done. On the left, we have some lighting notes from the color script developed in Cartoon Saloon with the help of Sanatan Suryavanshi and Sheldon Lesoy in Guru in Canada. This is a nice shot to see drop shadows, because there are actually two different light sources dropping two different color shadows. This is something one might actually try to avoid if they were producing this manually using real paper under a camera, but we specifically wanted to tap into the little things that identify paper cutout as such, because we felt it imbued some of the naivety of the storytelling into the imagery. This shot is also nice to see some transparency around the inner rim of the mirror. This would actually be a relatively difficult shot to achieve physically, as you'd need to place all the action that's happening inside the mirror on a third sheet of glass down in order to get the depth looking correct. So it would actually be a deceptively difficult shot to do. This is a great shot to see some extreme lighting changes. There are some nice edge effects that highlight here, especially on the plants. And again, this would have been a difficult shot to do physically, as we sort of are blurring the border between top lighting and back lighting as the red cloud passes through, which also produces some sort of subtle transparency effects happening. And this shot is one I really, really love, and I've already shown it to you a couple of times. The Moho export there on the top right, that has a sort of a mock-up of the flickering light, but in Nuke we went much further, as you can see. In this shot, Parwana is struggling to remember the story of the girl in the crown. So thus we see the face emerge from the light, or emerge from the darkness, as if lit by just a flickering candlelight. And on the bottom left there, you can see some notes from Guru about how each piece of shiny material would be given a different depth and a sense of specularity or shininess. We actually based these on shiny candy wrappers, so we had to buy a lot of sweets for research. Okay, these are a pair of shots I love too. We went really far with keeping this nice and dark, and I bet... Oh, it's looking okay, cool. We went really far with it. Only some sort of laser pointer reds in the jaguar's eyes. When the lightning flashes, we actually use intense brightness that in its own way, it probably wouldn't be flattering to the cutout medium, but between the darkness and these flashes is a real sort of tactile sense of paper and cardboard happening. And another thing I really love about this is the effect we see in the sky behind, because it really gives the impression of backlighting through, a kind of a grease paper to imply that there's sheet lightning happening behind thick clouds. I think this might be the last shot I'm going to show you. Okay, here's one where we push just well past the color script briefing on the side there. We decided to let the green of the emeralds shift the white balance completely, so the skeletons actually appear green rather than white. And this is a section of the film I think was actually really successful in the end. So yeah, I think probably what we couldn't have achieved if we had tried this with physical camera rigs would be the complex lighting that Guru were able to bring to some of our more epic scenes, along with the extremely complex camera moves, which in a physical rig would require dozens of sheets of glass to achieve that kind of depth. We have one or two pans in the film that would require like a runway length of glass in order to make this work. I feel like we just couldn't have hit this wow factor if we'd attempted to do it physically on the budget we had. But I would actually be happy to be proven wrong on that. Like, I wonder if some of the builders and riggers in Aardman or Leica who have built warehouse-sized stop-motion rigs, maybe they look at this and think it's just very doable. Maybe, I don't know. Okay, everyone, that's all from me. Thanks again. Thanks for taking an hour to listen to me ramble away. As I said, my name's Mark Mullery. It's been a real honor to speak here. My next big project is called Wolfwalkers. It's Tom Moore's third feature, for which I'll be the assistant director. So maybe I'll be back in a couple of years to talk about that.